So Larry gave us a great introduction to this next panel, actually, really making the case for why we're now talking about alternatives. And in this panel, we're kind of going to get into the nitty-gritty, not just the big picture, but kind of like, if you want to do something, what would you do and why? And so what we've done is we've actually asked people we've assigned them tasks and said, please tell us the pros and cons of each of the following. Now, we have this amazing panel. They don't need an introduction, which is great because I don't really have time to introduce everybody. But let me just tell you who's coming, what the order. So the first one is Olivier Blanchard from Peterson is going to talk about the pros and cons of raising the inflation target. Then Jeff Frankel from Harvard is going to talk about the case for nominal GDP targeting. John Williams, President and CEO of Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, is going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a price level target. And then finally, Rick Mission is going to talk about why we might want to stick with our current framework, perhaps tweak it a bit. And then Ben Bernanke is going to respond to all of them. So here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to go sit down. They're going to come up and do their thing, go sit back down, and then when they're all finished, we're going to sit up here and have a conversation. So, thank you very much.
So I was given the task of defending the case for a higher inflation target rate. That's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to make 6 points. The first one is that the 2% target as a precise estimate comes out of nowhere in terms of at least coming out of a serious analytical quantitative exercise. There's a very nice survey by somebody called Dirks, who has looked at 161 papers on the optimal inflation rate. Of 106 which have the guts to actually give a number, 33 give a negative number. These are the ones which typically go the Friedman route and ignore nominal rigidities. 50 say 0 or close. 15 say 0 to 2, and 9 say 2 to 6. That gives a sense of what you get when you try to do it. If you look, I haven't looked at the 161 studies, but if you look, it looks like none of them comes close to capturing what we think are the many benefits and costs of inflation. I mean, if you take the Fisher-Modigliani list, which is kind of a classic in that respect, it's very hard to formalize them, and most of the formal studies really don't do that. The worst one is probably the so-called new Keynesian model, in which the welfare cost of inflation, I think, is just not what it is about in reality. So I think we have to keep this in mind. 2% is a political number. It's an important number, but it's not the result of a consistent set of studies. The second point is a point that Larry made, which is whatever rate you thought was optimal in 2006, you have to revise it up for 2 reasons. The first one is that the neutral rate has decreased, and again, we just had a discussion as to whether it will stay or not, but there is a possibility that it stays very low or even goes lower, and that's the branch of the fork that we have to care about. And the other is that we basically know that there can be very large and deep recessions, and then you really need to use something very strongly. So for both reasons, whatever, even if the 2% was exactly the right number based on what we knew in 2006, it cannot be the right number today. It has to be a high number. And that's just, so the question is, what do you do next? So it seems to me, from a conceptual point of view, the right answer is negative nominal rate. And I think in that respect, conceptually, Ken Rogoff is completely right. I think it will come. I mean, I think we're moving to electronic money, and it will make it much easier to actually have. And cash is going to largely disappear. You might still be able to keep cash, but it's going to become less and less convenient, less and less used, and therefore it will eventually, I think, be the solution. If I were to think about where we are in 10 years, I suspect that that's the right way to do it and will be the feasible way to do it, but not yet, and so we have to think about what we do before. So the next step is to say, well, yes, I mean, sometimes we need inflation because we need large negative real rates and the nominal rate is at zero. So let's try to generate inflation when we need it rather than all the time. All the time means distortions all the time, where if you just have it when you need it, then clearly it is much better if you can. So these are the various schemes which try to convince people that when inflation is low or recession is there, then you basically are going to have more inflation later. So it can be price level targeting. It can be the variation that Ben has developed at the conference a few months ago, which can be thought of as asymmetric price level targeting. It does it when it's really needed on one side, but not on the other. I think, like Larry, rather negative, rather pessimistic about the ability of moving expectations in that way when you need them. I mean, the way I read the Japanese experience is that it's very hard to move expectations in this way just when you need them. If you could, that would be a solution, but I don't think it is. So this was the fourth point. The fifth point is, well, what's next? And what's next is higher permanent inflation or average inflation. And I have no doubt that we can get there. We just have to overheat the economy enough and we'll get to whatever number, 4% if we want, or 5%. What are the costs of 4%? I really don't see the cost of 4% as being much higher than the cost of 2%. I think most of the costs in practice have to do with distortions from the fact that the tax system and the transfer system is not indexed. And I think indexing many of the aspects of a tax system would get rid of it, of most of the distortions. There is one distortion, which I think is money illusion. And people are subject to money illusion, and it would be difficult. So some of them will get confused. Now, whether it's good or bad from a welfare point of view, money illusion, in a way, makes people happier because they think that they're getting the nominal rate. They think of it as a real rate, and they feel happier. But they may make mistakes in choosing portfolios. So this is an issue which I think we have to think about. But I'm not sure that 4% is really the end of the world. So this was the fifth point. And then the sixth point, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot by basically taking the position that there's a good reason not to want to go to 4%. But this is something I believe. I think one of the great advantages of what we've had until now is that inflation is no longer salient. Inflation was on our mind when we had to take mortgages, and inflation was 5–10%, and we really had to think about it, and everybody had to think about it in some way. I think most of us, as individuals, not as professional economists, have not thought much about inflation in the last few years. It's just very low, and that's exactly what Greenspan wanted, basically a level of inflation which is sufficiently low that nobody cares. Now, why is this good? Because in terms of a Phillips curve, it basically means that the expectations of inflation don't move. And so what you have, as long as you don't abuse it, is a downward sloping Phillips curve that you can use. You can basically, you have a trade-off between inflation and employment. It's much easier to do monetary policy with sticky expectations than with expectations which move. I think if we move to 4%, I don't know exactly what the limit is, but I suspect that if we move to 4%, then people will be more aware of movements in inflation, and then we get into what we've seen in the past, which is expectations of inflation adjusting to movements in inflation faster, making the job of a central bank more difficult. But on that, I've made 6 points, 5 in favor, 1 not, and I shall stop here.
So my job is to make the case for nominal GDP targeting. Do we have my slides here? And also to point out drawbacks. Drawbacks against. Like Olivier, I have six points. That's not mine. Broadly, I'm going to state a principle. I'm going to make a proposal. I'm going to make the case for, and as assigned, I will duly make some drawbacks. Okay, thank you very much. So that's me. Just to start on a basic principle, and I'm going to try to bridge so I'm not out here all on my own about nominal GDP, bridge to the rest of the discussion this afternoon. And actually, Larry did it already in his answer to David Wessel's question about if you were to do nominal GDP targeting, how would it be? What he said is very succinctly what I'm going to say. But to build on the bridge to the rest of the remarks that everyone else is going to make, let me start with a basic principle. What is the point of announcing a target, or if it's not a target, for forward guidance or communication? It's credibility. And the target, therefore, is less useful if it's something that the authorities are chronically unable to achieve and that you can predict ahead of time that they're going to be unable to achieve. Then you don't get the credibility. So I'm going to be a little negative here on inflation targeting. The main point when Ben set a goal, 2% inflation, and when some other central banks did it as well, was to get the economy back to full employment. That has failed. We haven't hit the 2% goal. Neither has the Bank of England or the ECB or Japan. So I'm a little surprised when I hear, how should we think 5 years later about this? We set a target, we failed to achieve it, so the response is to set a more aggressive target? I mean, here's New Year's resolutions. You're going to lose 5 pounds, or in this case, I guess, gain 5 pounds. You missed the target, so you say, next time I'm going to resolve to gain 10 pounds? If the first one wasn't credible, the second one will be less credible. That applies to raising the target. I think it also, in my view, with respect to the people speaking both before me and after me, I think it applies to a price level target. Very elegant. People have to believe it. They're not going to believe it after the failure to hit the inflation target. Fortunately, we have achieved what we really were interested in, which is getting back to full employment. That's the good news. I will say that if the question is if inflation targeting means central bank should be transparent about what it sees the inflation rate at being in the long term and say that that's 2%. Like in the survey of summary of economic projections, you say what you think the long run unemployment rate is, long run growth rate. That's fine. I'm all in favor of that. But you're not really staking credibility on it. Okay, point number 2, and this is a more important question. Not the really long term, but if the central bank wants to signal its intentions at a horizon of 1 to 2 years, either through a formal target or forward guidance or a threshold like the Fed did with unemployment and the Bank of England some years back, what is the best economic variable to use to signal your intentions? Inflation, M1, exchange rate, price of gold, short-term interest rates, unemployment rate, so on. My claim is, and my assignment before you today, is to defend the proposition that if central banks want to communicate their intentions at a 1 to 2 year horizon, it would be more effective if they phrased that commitment or that communication or that guidance in terms of nominal GDP rather than in terms of CPI inflation. Now, of course, you can't hit it exactly. About as far as you could go would be to say the mandate of the central bank is to do everything it possibly can to get as close as possible, and then if the governor fails, then he or she is fired. You know, I mean, that was like the fantasy we all had about New Zealand in the 90s. I don't think they ever actually did that. But anyway, that would be like the most extreme. I think such a level of a commitment, whether it's inflation or nominal GDP or anything else, is not credible. I'm going to make a very non-threatening, very mild proposal. The FOMC releases its summary of economic projections, I think every 6 weeks. And it's submitted by the governors and the bank presidents. And I propose adding nominal GDP as a row in that table. My first choice is that it be the first row of the table before real growth, unemployment, CPI, Fed's rate. So if you're not familiar with it, and it gets much less attention than the dots plot, here is the most recent one from December. First row is projected change in real GDP. Second row is unemployment rate. Third is PCE inflation, core inflation, interest rates. I propose we add a row for nominal GDP. And even if the members initially just have the rate of growth of nominal GDP, they just construct it by adding together their forecast for the real growth rate and the inflation rate, I'll go along with that. But I prefer that it be the first row and that it get a little of attention and that the Fed be signaling that they're starting to pay attention to it. There slide in that row. All right, now the main point. What is the case for nominal GDP? I want to give a little bit of historical background in case people aren't in favor of it, aren't familiar with it, what the case was when it was first proposed in the 1980s before getting to my main point, what's the case for it lately. It was originally proposed at a time when the target to beat was M1. Milton Friedman's monetarism had triumphed. The Fed and the Bundesbank and the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England were setting M1 targets. And a number of economists pointed out that these were not robust. The first two were Nobel Prize winners, James Mead and James Tobin. But lots of other people, including some people in this room, and I had a paper, did some analysis to make the point. At that time, the point was that nominal GDP is robust with respect to velocity shocks. The alternative to beat was an M1 target. An M1 target was needlessly destabilizing if there were shifts in velocity, their demand for money, and a nominal GDP target automatically, by definition, offset that. So that was the strong case. Lots of us were in favor of it. Nobody ever did it, not sure why. Now, fast forward, nominal GDP targeting underwent a revival around 2011 and 2012. Circumstances were quite different. Once again, a whole array of people coming out in favor of it. There was Mark Carney. It got a certain amount of attention then around the time he was taking office as governor of the Bank of England. There were academic articles, David Woodford. It was big in the blogosphere, a bunch of bloggers on it. Here's just a partial list of people who have written on the case for nominal GDP targeting over the last 7 years. Now, things are quite different. The alternative to beat, of course, is not M1. The alternative to beat is a CPI target, either core or headline or level or change, whatever. The case in favor of nominal GDP targeting is still that it is more robust with respect to shocks. You're more likely to be able to live with it ex post than a CPI target. You're less likely to regret, why did I ever say that? Now I'm going to have trouble fulfilling it. But now it's robustness with respect to aggregate supply shocks that are the point, because the alternative to beat is a CPI target. And by aggregate supply shocks, I mean productivity shocks, commodity shocks, natural disasters. I've written that these are particularly relevant in developing countries. That's kind of my little slice of it. In the presence of an adverse supply shock, an inflation target implies needlessly tight monetary policy. It says that so inflation targeting says that you have to take the entire shock in terms of lost output, and you can't let it show up at all in terms of high inflation. My main point, big argument in favor of nominal GDP targeting is it allows the impact of the shift to be automatically divided between some loss of price stability and some loss on the output objective. And this surely comes much closer to what is the ultimate objective function, the loss function that we're seeking. And let me give you an example of how the inflation target can get you into trouble, how it can push the authorities to tighten in the face of an adverse shock, thereby needlessly worsening the fall in output. The best example, I think, is July 2008. U.S. has already gone into recession. The world is sliding into what will be the Great Recession. All the forecasts, IMF, everyone was marking down estimates of growth. What does the ECB do? In July 2008, they raised interest rates. Why did they raise interest rates? I think because there was a spike in oil prices and they were concerned about the CPI target. So this is an example where actually the movement was in the wrong direction and a nominal GDP target would have given you the right answer. Here is my graph to illustrate the central point. Horizontal axis is real economic activity. Vertical axis is price level or inflation. The aggregate supply curve slopes up. If prices go up, firms produce more, have higher profit margins. Aggregate demand curve slopes down. We expect to be at point A. In normal times, we're around point A. But we have a supply shock, and this is a negative adverse supply shock. An oil price increase, adverse productivity shock, a natural disaster, a flood, whatever. That shifts the curve up. Inflation targeting, if it means something, if you take it literally or think it has an effect, that means we have to go to point B. We have to constrict demand, constrict monetary policy, constrict demand so much that the CPI doesn't rise at all, and the entire adverse impact is felt in terms of GDP, which is not good, not what we want. Point C is where we want to be, or somewhere close to that. That's the nominal GDP target. Automatically, that's the monetary policy that is called for, divides the adverse supply shock equally into an increase in the price level and a loss in output. Okay, to complete my assignment, last point, I'm supposed to also mention the drawbacks. It does have drawbacks. I'm going to name 3. Maybe the one you hear the most often is the central bank can't hit nominal GDP targets. Well, of course, but you also can't hit CPI targets. You also can't hit M1 targets. And I would argue it's more likely that you could hit your nominal GDP target because it's something that you can live with, whereas the others, M1 target would have had a disastrous implication if we'd stuck with it in 1982, and so on, inflation targets when there's an adverse supply shock. Objection number 2, the person in the street does not understand nominal GDP, how it breaks down into real GDP versus price level. I think that's true. But to my mind, that's all the more reason to avoid setting a CPI target where after the shock occurs, you have to explain to people with these kind of pitiful sounding excuses why you're going to miss it. Oh, don't worry, it's only an increase in the cost of filling up your tank of gas and buying your groceries. Don't worry about that. It's really hard to explain it away ex post. All the more reason to build it in ex ante with a nominal GDP target that you can live with. Finally, it is pointed out that nominal GDP targets are revised ex post, and that kind of complicates it. And that seems to me a valid drawback, but not fatal. It's the same as the point that, of course, we can't hit our targets exactly. Thank you.
Great. My assignment is to talk about price level targeting, which is actually very, very closely, very close to nominal GDP targeting. But I'm going to step back and kind of pick up on the starting point, I think, for this whole conversation that Larry Summers highlighted. And that is the issue of kind of why is this issue such a very real concern. So these are some of estimates that we have of the neutral or natural or equilibrium short-term real interest rate. In the blue line shows estimates for the United States. This is an average of 3 estimates that do come out of the San Francisco Fed, a couple that I've worked on with Thomas Laubach and Catherine Holston, and also estimates that come from my colleagues Jens Christensen and Glenn Ruderbush, who are just using data from financial markets, trying to infer from the TIPS market what our market participants think the short-term real interest rate is going to be, say, 6 to 10 years from now. As you can see here, Larry talked about a number of, like 1%. You can see based on our estimates, the current estimates are running around a quarter percent today. The red line shows our estimates from our model for 3 other economies. Is a GDP-weighted average of the Euro area economies, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Those estimates are averaging around 0.5%. So 2 points I just make is that starting this debate around a 1% equilibrium or normal real interest rate, I think is actually higher than many of the estimates. There are other estimates that are higher, but at least these estimates are quite low. And the second, I think, more important point is they haven't moved back up. I mean, they wiggle around a little bit, but as you see in the United States, this is again picking up on Larry's point, the trend, if anything, is downward. And even as the United States economy, for example, this goes through 2017 Q3, as unemployment's come down to close 4%, the economy has gotten back to full employment, we still see no signs that this in the neutral interest rate is moving back up. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that these movements in the natural rate of interest, not only in the United States, but in all other advanced economies, and we didn't study Japan, but colleagues of mine have also found for Japan the natural rate is very low. These are driven by what I think of as global factors, primarily demographics. People are living longer in general, population growth has shrunken dramatically in these economies. Second is lower productivity trends, maybe changes in technology. And third is this increased demand for safe assets or convenience yield. So these are long-term, sustained, fundamental changes in the global economy that I think will likely be with us. And as Larry said in his opening remarks, this just means that central banks, whether in the US, in Europe, or in Japan, or around the world, have far less room to cut interest rates when that next recession comes, and that surely will happen at some point. So to me, the question really is what to do about this new reality. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about price level targeting. And so what I want to just get people to maybe not be quite so afraid of price level targeting. It sounds radical, it sounds very different, but really it's a very modest difference from historically what we think of as inflation targeting. Instead of thinking about the central bank trying to get inflation back to 2% once over the next few years, you're really thinking about trying to keep the price level, say, for example, growing 2% a year. So it's not a radical shift in framework or objectives, it's really just a matter of defining what we think about in terms of price stability. And I think an important reason that in price level targeting, an important advantage price level targeting has is really in the context of this issue of the very low neutral rate. So let's just do what I think of as the unpleasant arithmetic around inflation targeting. So in good times, like we're having today, we'll get our goal in the Fed and in other countries is to move inflation back to our 2% goal. And in good times, half the time we'll be above 2%, half the time we'll be below 2%, and that's all good. But as was pointed out already by Larry, once in a while, maybe once a decade or a little more frequently, we'll have a recession. If that recession is severe enough, the fact that we hit the zero lower bound, despite the best efforts of conventional, unconventional policy, will probably struggle with getting inflation back to the 2%, or will take longer to get there. So now you have this asymmetric behavior of inflation over history. During good times, on average, you're trying to keep it at 2%. During bad recessions, you get long periods where inflation was missing the target. Of course, we've been experiencing that in the US, and quite honestly, across almost all advanced economies over the last 7 or 8 years. So when you do that arithmetic, what you find is that on average, inflation is well below the 2% target. This is just the combination of trying to hit 2% in good times and the fact that in bad times there's a bias towards being under the target. In the Kiley Roberts paper that Larry Summers mentioned, in their model, they found that the average inflation rate under a standard kind of policy rule would be, I think, 0.8 of a percentage point below the target, meaning the average inflation rate would be about 1.2%. I actually agree that that's probably an overestimate of the effects, but if you look at a lot of other papers, including work I've done with Dave Reichschneider and others, you still, or a generic finding of this literature is if you're at the lower bound 10, 20, maybe 30% of the time, you're going to have a bias of inflation on average being below your target. And what that means is two things. First of all, you have this issue that Jeff brought up of the credibility, that you're missing your target a lot, and it sounds like the central bank is not committed to achieving its goals, despite doing its best to achieve them. But the second is actually something that I think is underappreciated in the discussion, and that is that once the kind of market participants and people in the economy, people in business and households realize that inflation on average is probably going to be below the 2% target, that gets into inflation expectations and actually makes it harder to achieve the 2% objective even in good times. So the two challenges with inflation targeting in a normal procedure where you basically say, I just want to move inflation back to the target as appropriately, is that on average, inflation will be below that target just because of this zero lower bound. And the second is that spills over into inflation expectations, making the job even harder. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, the solution to this problem is to get the average inflation rate back to 2% over long periods of time. So meaning to undo this bias or asymmetry in the behavior of inflation inflation that comes from the zero lower bound constraining the ability to add stimulus during recessions, especially severe recessions. Now, price level targeting, actually mathematically and formally and technically, I think someone described it as beautiful, maybe Jeff said that, is exactly designed for that. Basically, what you're saying is, I want the price level to grow by 2%. For example, you could have a 3% target or a 1% target, but choosing a target that grows, say, 2% a year over the next 30 years. And if you have a period of a severe recession where inflation averaged less than 2%, for example, like we've had in the United States for the last decade, then you would be promising to have somewhat above 2% inflation for the next decade to get this average right, to cement the inflation expectations at your target, and basically undo this problem that the zero lower bound and the very low R star is creating. Now, there are various variations on this. Ben will, I'm sure, talk about his variation. Actually, nominal income targeting has this flavor too. I think these are all different ways to try to achieve this goal, and I'm not really going to say, well, I think one is absolutely better than the other. I will say that this notion of assuring people that when they're planning for the future, if you're buying a car and you're buying a house, saving for your retirement or for your kids' education, that you have this notion that, you know, inflation, I understand what inflation on average will be over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, the kind of horizons that households and businesses often think about. I think that's one of the real strengths of a price level target over this issue with an inflation target, where you're going to be missing your goal for long periods of time. Now, in terms of counter arguments, and kind of thinking about this, I think, you know, it does sound a little scary. Typically what I hear is you're going to create a recession because you have a run-up in inflation and you have to reverse that. That's one counter argument. The other is it's hard to explain. So I want everyone to take a deep breath, feel comfortable, because I'm going to show you it's not nearly as scary as you might think. So I have a second chart, and that's it. And that is, this is a simple calculation. I don't want you to take it too seriously, but this is from 2005 to the third quarter of 2017. The black line is the federal funds rate target, this actual and short-term interest rate. The red line is a Taylor rule. Now here I'm just using a very stylized example. I'm not arguing that price level targeting, you'd have to think about this in this particular way. I'm just trying to illustrate the idea. If you look at the red line, that would show you what a Taylor rule, where interest rates move up and down depending on the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. And the blue line is exactly the same Taylor rule that John Taylor laid out, using the unemployment rate, however, as a measure of economic activity. But here I've replaced the inflation gap, the inflation term on the right-hand side in terms of the deviation from the target, with a price level target that starts in 2005. And I only want to make 2 points on this. One is, we did have an overshoot of inflation in the mid-2000s before the recession. Both the Taylor rule and the price level targeting rule have interest rates going up quite a bit. But as you can see, this price level targeting rule has interest rates move up roughly like they did what the Federal Reserve actually did. Both of these rules cut interest rates dramatically when the recession hit, because unemployment skyrocketed, inflation came down. So again, these policies, and I'm not putting in a zero lower bound, that's why it's going negative. Both of these policies are doing basically the same thing, and this is the last point I'll end with. What's critical is the price level targeting rule notices that we're missing on our inflation target roughly year after year, and therefore keeps interest rates lower for longer after a very severe recession where inflation was very low. It basically tries to add extra, or promises extra stimulus to help guide the economy, guide the economic expansion higher, and also bring inflation back. And as you can see in this particular example, it actually traces out at least above the zero lower bound, roughly the path that the FOMC has taken. So again, I don't see the price level targeting as really scary when you have high inflation, or in the 2005 period, or even particularly now. The last thing I will say on my mind, I'm already over time, but the thing I will say that on this credibility issue, this only works, this kind of change in strategy only works if it's a commitment to a long-term change in strategy. This is not something you do opportunistically, say, well, we're going to have a price level target for the next few years, and then after that, change strategy. I think what we do need to say is whatever strategy we do, whether it's temporary price level targeting like BAN or nominal income targeting or maybe just standard price level targeting, it's a commitment to follow that strategy or framework for year after year so that people see that we're following it and that expectations are aligned with it. So I think that's just an important concern with any shift in framework, is for it to really work as effectively as we hope, there has to be a commitment to stay on that for a number of years. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if this works. There we go. So I'm actually going to talk about a lot of the comments that have already been made, anticipating. I didn't see theirs beforehand. But I think the first thing that we want to do is look back and say, why are we here? Why do we have to think about rethinking the inflation target? And it's the key lessons from recent years, and I want to draw two of them. The first is that the zero lower bound constraint on monetary policy binds much more often than we expected before the crisis occurred. And there are three reasons, which have been really mentioned earlier on. First is that the economy can be very nonlinear. So the way of thinking of this is that we had a Wile E. Coyote situation starting in 2007 and 2008, where the economy went to a financial crisis and Wile E. Coyote went over the canyon and then realized that there was a problem and fell down and crashed. So this fact that the economy is nonlinear is one that can actually lead to more frequent hits of the zero lower bound. The second is that financial disruptions can actually have much bigger effects than we expected. Unfortunately, that happened to us. And the third, which has been emphasized by by John and Larry and so forth, is that the natural rate of interest has fallen. And so as a result, you're more likely to hit the zero lower bound. The other problem is that once the zero lower bound constraint occurs, it's much harder to stimulate the economy and raise inflation. Again, this is a point that's been made. Non-conventional tools are less effective than we had hoped. And in fact, if you think about what the key problem for central banks right now is that it's very hard to get inflation up to the levels we'd like them to be, so that the zero lower bound problem is actually worse than we expected. So as a result, that means that we have to rethink the inflation target. And one approach is, which is Olivier mentioned, which is that the inflation target should be raised to something like the 4% level. And the theoretical argument for this is, by the way, very strong. So this is the pros. With a higher target, you have basically a higher natural rate of the nominal interest rate. So you actually are going to have the zero lower bound occur less frequently. And basically, with the higher target for inflation, conventional monetary policy is actually going to have more room in order to stimulate the economy when you get a big negative hit, as we've had recently. But there are some serious cons here, and so I want to discuss these, because you're going to see that I'm not going to advocate that we raise the inflation target to 4%. The first is that it's really more difficult to stabilize inflation at the 4% level rather than the 2% level. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why I think this is the case. The first is that Greenspan had this beautiful definition of price stability, which is sort of similar to the definition of what the Supreme Court defined pornography. You sort of know when you see it. Well, in this case, he basically said that price stability is when economic agents are not spending a lot of time worrying about inflation in terms of what they're doing. And that actually is something that's very positive for the economy in terms of getting people to focus on what they really should do, which is produce goods with very low cost rather than worrying about financial transactions and dealing with inflation. The problem here is that once you get above to something like 4%, I don't think that's consistent with the Greenspan definition. And then if it's 4%, why not 6? Why not 8? And you can get a spiral where, in fact, the commitment to keep inflation low is disappearing. And in fact, we went through that situation in the 1970s. And so when we think about this, how do we get into a situation like this? Well, think about what happened in the 1960s. That there was a view that you could tolerate 4 to 5% inflation. This is the famous paper by Samuelson and Solow. What happened? Yeah, we got to 4, but then why not 6? And what we had was the so-called great inflation, which was a very bad period in terms of monetary policy. And in fact, another key lesson that we really learned from the last 20 years is how valuable it is to anchor inflation expectations at a particular number. And indeed, this case, the central banks have been successful at anchoring at 2%. And that was extremely important in terms of both limiting the variability of inflation, but also allowing central banks like the Federal Reserve to be extremely aggressive during the crisis in terms of actually pursuing very expansionary monetary policy in order to get out of the crisis and not worry that inflation expectations were going to spiral out of control and that you'd get into a problem. So it actually gave more flexibility to the Federal Reserve. The other issues are that, that there are problems in the long run that you have to worry about. So even though having higher inflation may have some welfare costs, you think in the short run, well, that's not a big deal, but think that this happens continually, these welfare costs actually start building up and become serious numbers, so that they may be small in any given year, but actually over time they become very substantial. So when I look at this, my view is, should we raise the inflation target above 2%? And I think the answer is no. And this is a cost-benefit calculation. The cost of raising the inflation target to 4% outweighs the benefits. So how might we tweak the inflation target? And I would argue that monetary policy should at times, and now is the time, should at times think about overshooting the 2% inflation goal. And so the key problem here is that inflation targeting, this is something that John mentioned, it's not what we call history dependent. It treats bygones as bygones. So if you've been undershooting, no, it doesn't matter, you keep on shooting for 2%. And there's a compelling theoretical argument, this is Woodford's famous tome, that in fact you want to have history-dependent policy, in which when you have undershoots of the target, you want to have overshoots of the target, so that on average, inflation is going to be at a level which is consistent with your goals. And this is something that John just mentioned. So if you think about this, price level targeting is exactly one of these forms of history-dependent policy, and it actually produces less output variance. So the way to think about why it works well is that when you get a negative demand shock, which results in the price level falling below the target path, which you say is 2% growth of the price level at a steady rate, then what happens is that because you're undershooting, you now have to get back up to the target, the price level target, and that means that in fact you're temporarily going to have higher inflation. That higher inflation then feeds into expectations, which lowers the real interest rate if you're at the zero lower bound, and provides exactly the stimulus that you want in that particular kind of situation. So really what you've done is put an automatic stabilizer into monetary policy is the way to think of this. And of course this is really very important when you hit the zero lower bound situation, but actually is valuable even when you don't. Another similar policy is a nominal GDP target, which Jeff was talking about. And it actually, in a sense, has even more desirable characteristics. If you look at the Eggers and Woodford work, what they do is they say the target criterion should not just be in terms of the price level, but also should it be in terms of where you are relative to the natural rate of output. And so what that does, this output-adjusted price level target, turns out to be not too far away from a nominal GDP target, and so has even more desirable characteristics. But I want to argue that there are some real big challenges to both the price level targeting and nominal GDP targets. And in fact, John Murray may talk about this. I think it's one of the reasons why the Canada, even though they sort of liked price level targets, didn't go to it. I think it's really much harder to explain that you're aiming for a target that's moving, because we don't think that you should have the price level target just always at the same level, that it always has an upward path. It's harder to shoot for a moving target in explaining it. So one is a communications challenge. And the second issue is that because it's harder to explain, when inflation temporarily rises above 2%, people may start to worry that you're not really living with the 2% inflation goal, and that could unhinge inflation expectations. The nominal GDP target has one of the problems that Jeff mentioned. Jeff mentioned that it had a problem in terms of people might not know what nominal GDP is. That's an issue. But I think more important is that it's really hard to know what that nominal GDP level should be. That there's a lot of debate about what potential GDP should be or what the natural rate of unemployment is. We know that we really don't know. And in fact, we know that that when periods when there were mistakes made on this, there were big mistakes made in terms of monetary policy. In the 1970s are the classic example where there was a view that the natural rate of unemployment was around 4% when it was closer to 6%, and monetary policy was much too expansionary, and we got the great inflation. So I think this is one of the reasons why we haven't seen adoption of this kind of target. So how do you skin the cat? My view is, how do we basically still have this 2% anchored inflation expectations, but have this history dependence? And I would argue that the way that we should think about doing this is to think about inflation targets not in terms of shooting for 2% 2 years from now, but the average inflation rate should be 2% over a period. And in fact, Ben actually just recently made a proposal about this. I actually made this proposal a year ago. Didn't know about Ben. Ben hadn't seen it. And so great minds think alike, but sometimes I wonder maybe it's not such great minds. We just work together too much. So that could be a problem as well. But the idea here is that you have a 2% target over a particular period. So say 5 years is one example, but in fact I think Ben's suggestion that you do it since the zero lower bound hit is actually very much in this kind of framework. And there are some subtleties about whether you want to do one or the other, and we can talk about that later. So what does this do for you? If you had inflation running at about 1.5%, and you have a 2% target, that means that you have to do 2.5% for a while. And so the desirability of this is that you get exactly the kind of history dependence we want, which is that inflation expectations would rise for a temporary period of time, which would actually make the zero lower bound have more expansionary effects. So, but even if you worry about what Jeff is worried, that you might not actually have an expectations channel, which I'm not going to agree with, but I think is a serious issue. One of the key points here is that no matter what, even if that didn't work, it's still telling you you want to be more expansionary than you otherwise would be, which is the right policy. So in that sense, I think it has its desirable characteristics. By the way, is this pie in the sky stuff? No, it isn't. The Reserve Bank of Australia, I'm very partial to them. I visit them all the time, and Sydney is my favorite city in the world, so I'm a little bit too partial to them. But in fact, this kind of policy is exactly the kind of policy that the Reserve Bank of Australia has done. By the way, knowing the history of this, it was actually sort of an accident, but I don't want to go into that. I was there when they were actually formulating this. But what they've done is they have a target which is 2 to 3%, and they interpret that as shooting for 2.5% on average over the business cycle, and they've had very, very good performance. I should mention that, as my mother always said to me, it's better to be lucky than good. So they have an element of that as well. But what we've seen is that if Australia's had an average inflation rate over the last 25 years of just 2.7 versus 2.5, pretty damn good, and they haven't had a recession in 25 years. And indeed, if you actually take this kind of approach that I've mentioned, which is very similar to what Curtia looked at, who's somebody who's at John Williams' shop, that what he did is he actually looked at a case of what you would do if, in fact, you were doing something like this and had a 2.5% inflation goal for a short period of time, you actually would have produced much better outcomes in the U.S. Using the standard models. So what's my bottom line? My bottom line is that the Fed and other central banks should commit to an average inflation rate of 2%, so they still stick with the 2% number. But they do it over a fixed period of years, say 5 years. It could be over a business cycle. Another approach would be Ben's, that you do it since the zero lower bound has started. And you actually commit to doing that as a modification of the long-run inflation goals of the Federal Reserve. However, it's extremely important that when you do this, you make it very clear that what you're really shooting for is a 2% long-run target, so that you keep on anchoring those expectations. And to me, this is sort of a way of getting the best of all worlds, getting to a lot of the issues that Larry, Jeff, John and Jeff have raised, but doing it in a way that I think is actually practically more practical and also something that would have very good outcomes. So thank you very much.
Okay, now I'm going to put this all in context. So first, thanks to David Wessel and the Hutchins Center for organizing this. I want to first say that I agree entirely with Larry Summers' initial comments that thinking now about how monetary policy can respond to the next recession is very important. I know the Federal Reserve, we can tell from the minutes and from the speeches that they are thinking about it. So I strongly support the general effort to do that. I think as we do that, though, we do have to keep in mind, it's like the joke about how do you get to Tipperary? We don't start from here. We're not starting with a blank slate. We do have a system, a framework, a 2% target in which there's a tremendous amount of investment in the sense of communication, of years of experience, and anchoring of expectations around a 2% inflation target. So I think that argument, the argument that says, well, what would we do if we started from scratch is interesting for academics, but maybe not the most relevant question, starting from where we are. In particular, yes, it may be the case that the optimal inflation target might be higher than 2, given what we know now, but if it's 2.2, I don't think that justifies a big change in framework. We have some fixed cost here, and as we look forward, we have to think about the benefits of changing, and we have to think about also, if we go to a new approach, suppose could happen in 10 years that nominal interest rates, that the equilibrium real interest rates will be higher. Maybe productivity will pick up. Artificial intelligence will finally start having the benefits we hope for. If we are locked into a higher inflation target in perpetuity, how would we respond to the next change in the environment? We're going to hear from the Bank of Canada about their 5-year process of reviewing, but I notice also that, which is very good and gotten a lot of praise from American policymakers, but I noticed that they haven't actually changed their framework. It is costly to change your framework, and so you need to make that case very strong. In terms of the individual approaches that have been suggested, I think the one that I'll just make a bold prediction: the Federal Reserve is not going to adopt a 4% inflation target. It's not going to happen. From a theoretical perspective, first of all, I think Woodford and others have shown it's a very inefficient way to deal with this problem. It's inefficient first because it gives you high inflation all the time, whether you're close to the zero lower bound or not. And secondly, when you are at the zero lower bound, it doesn't give you any particular additional push to get out of that ZLB situation. So it's not a very efficient approach. That's the theoretical objection. The political objection is that, the U.S. public is not going to be very open to a 4% or 5% inflation target. And in particular, I do worry that some of the people who are pushing this, so many of them are pro-expansionist. They might find if they open this up too much that they're going to end up with a change in the law that eliminates the employment goal, rather than and reasserts the price stability goal rather than what they're hoping for. So in terms of the options on the table, my own preference, I think, at least tentatively, like John Williams, is to look at some variant of price level targeting. It has the advantage that it maintains price stability. It's consistent with 2% inflation over time. In fact, with lower variance over time, you have more information about where inflation will be or prices will be in 10 years under a price level target than you do under an inflation target. And I think it's in many ways similar to the current framework. You'll just talk about average inflation rates over a period rather than inflation period by period. I do think that there are problems associated with undoing price level shocks away from the zero lower bound. If an oil price shock, you can do core inflation, that's true. I guess my own preference, as has already been alluded to, would be to apply this primarily at the zero lower bound, specifically when there is a deficit of inflation over a period where interest rates are at or close to zero. Then that deficit becomes an additional input into the policy debate, policy discussion, which leads, all else equal, to a tendency to overshoot inflation coming out of the zero lower bound. And to the extent that that is anticipated and understood in advance, that gives you greater policy stimulus and greater impact even going into the zero lower bound period. Now, one objection, there was sort of generic objection to changes from the inflation target is, well, we don't really believe that we can change expectations, that we can get people to believe some kind of different policy process. I realize it is difficult, and we've seen, for example, in the case of Japan, that it's hard to get expectations changed, which, of course, is a reason also why any change from the current system is going to be complicated. But I think that with the PLT, price level targeting, or temporary price level targeting approaches, your focus is not necessarily on getting the average person in the street to expect higher inflation coming out of a recession. Rather, your main audience is the financial markets. And we've seen from the recent experience with forward guidance that when the Fed announces they're going to keep rates lower for longer, the bond market reacts to that. So it may not be something that the average person or firm will respond to, but if the bond market responds to it, you get additional policy stimulus, I think it could be effective. On nominal GDP targeting, let me first of all reject two arguments for it and then explain why I think, though, it's still worth talking about. One argument, which we heard from Larry, is that if you raise your nominal GDP target, it'll disguise the fact that you're actually raising the inflation target. That's not going to work. People will notice that. The second argument, I think, came from Jeff, that he compared nominal GDP targeting to rigid or strict inflation targeting. In fact, inflation targeting is, quote, flexible, which means that, as stated in the Fed's policy principles, the time it takes to return to the inflation target depends on the state of the economy. And so, in fact, the inflation targeting can accommodate a supply shock. In fact, typically you look through a temporary supply shock as you move back to move to target. Now, I think the reason nominal GDP targeting is worth looking at is because it actually, despite the differences in appearance, is actually very similar to price level targeting, as John mentioned. So in particular, let me make the comparison. Growth level, the targeting of the nominal GDP growth rate is actually very similar to inflation targeting, flexible inflation targeting, and targeting the level of the nominal GDP is very similar to price level targeting. And one way to see that, let me talk about the relationship between growth targeting and inflation targeting. Targeting nominal GDP growth is just basically targeting the sum of real growth and inflation. And so it's like flexible flexible inflation targeting, that you're targeting inflation, but because you're also looking at GDP growth, you're allowing for lighter, easier policy when GDP is below trend and tighter policy when it's above trend. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of GDP targeting relative to, say, inflation targeting? One argument that's made is that nominal GDP targeting requires less information. You don't have to know, for example, what the natural rate of unemployment is to do a nominal GDP target. But on the other hand, you have to know what the nominal GDP is, and that is produced only with a lag and in a noisy way. And so that's a balance you have to make. Another argument is that nominal GDP targeting is less judgmental in the sense that it sort of builds in what your flexible response is to changes in GDP. Whereas inflation targeting, it's not quite so clear how the Fed will respond. Well, again, it depends on, there's costs and benefits of both approaches. I think one interesting aspect of nominal GDP targeting, which I just mentioned quickly, is that, as Larry mentioned, if you have, say, a fixed 6% nominal GDP target, if real GDP growth, potential GDP growth goes to 2, that automatically raises your inflation target to 4. Is that good or bad? Well, to the extent that nominal interest rates and nominal GDP growth tend to be similar, that has a tendency to kind of offset the problem of low nominal rates. The one problem with that, though, is that you could get in a situation of very low growth, and then the Fed would be essentially targeting high inflation. That's not going to be popular. It may not be sustainable. So anyway, my bottom line is that of the various things suggested, I think that variants of price level targeting are the most appealing to me. Though I recognize and I would recommend to the Fed they continue to look at nominal GDP measures because they are closely related to the price level targeting. Let me conclude, though, by sort of putting out what I consider to be a minimum requirement here at this point. So I think you can make the case, given I'm making this hypothetical case, I'm not saying it's absolutely correct, but you could make the case that with the cost of changing, and I think that, Larry may have overstated a bit, the severity, the cost of the zero lower bound where it is. Let me make a couple of points on that. One is that it's been pointed out in a paper by Fernald and others here at Brookings that the unemployment rate in the last recession came down about as quickly as normal. So if that's your best measurement of cyclical slack, the Fed did get cyclical slack down in a reasonable amount of time given how deep the recession was. Moreover, despite the fact that people think that zero lower bound may occur again, long-run estimates of inflation from forecasters and from inflation swaps and so on are still pretty close to 2%, which is suggesting that that the markets don't expect long periods of very low inflation because of the zero lower bound. So maybe what I'm arguing is that maybe the situation, even in the current status quo, isn't possibly as dire as was portrayed. And indeed, I guess the other argument I would make is that we've learned a lot, from the recent experience, not only in the United States but in Europe and elsewhere, about how to use unconventional policies, how to signal more effectively, how to coordinate QE and signaling, et cetera. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Fed decides that, given the cost of transition, that none of these alternatives are attractive. I think what they ought to do in that case, though, is add to their statement of policy, strategy, and principles a statement about how they're going to attack the next zero lower bound period, and be explicit about, at least in general terms, about how they would use forward guidance, quantitative easing, and what combination and what criteria to provide not only some clarity, but also to maybe even be effective in one of the benefits of these frameworks is that markets anticipate how the Fed will react even before you actually hit the zero lower bound. Possibly, if the Fed laid out in some kind of formal way how it expects to respond to the next ZLB, zero lower bound, that might actually make the probability of hitting that zero lower bound lower. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to tell all of you that we need to put the mic on when you speak, and it's that thing in the middle that looks like a person talking with things coming out of their mouth. That's the mic to press. It's a very odd-looking icon. Okay, thank you all. That was so interesting. I'm going to start off just actually with a clarification before we get into the meat of it, which is, so when people talk about these different targets or different framework, sometimes I get confused. We are talking, if you go for the price level or the higher inflation, to something that keeps the dual mandate and just affects the price piece of it, but keeps the unemployment piece. Is that right? But the nominal GDP would sort of combine them. Is that the right way to think about it? So we're not giving up on the unemployment piece?
Do you mind if I? Yeah.
No, please.
So I think that's a very important point because I think a number of people, when they hear price level targeting, they think of the kind of first generation of inflation targeting, where there was a unit or one goal of inflation. The way I described it in my picture was one where you have a dual mandate goal as a maximum employment and the price stability, and so you're managing both of those. Of course, the nominal GDP target also does that as well. It puts both of those goals on equal standing.
Let me just add to this that I think a key here is the word flexible inflation targeting. And this is why I agreed very strongly with Ben that the characterization of how to deal with supply shocks that Jeff pointed out is not the way that sensible inflation targeting is done. And that if you think about it, the way of thinking about what our approach is, we're basically trying to optimize by minimizing output gaps and inflation gaps. And indeed, a way of talking about this, communicating it, is with a flexible inflation targeting framework. So it's basically this another way of saying the same thing.
I just actually had a question for you, Jeff. So, and Ben mentioned this a little. I was not sure when you were talking about the nominal GDP targeting if we were talking about growth rates or levels, and those seem to be very different.
Well, I'm with Ben here. There's a close analogy. The questions are sort of orthogonal. There's a elegant argument in favor of the level. There's a more practical argument in favor of the rate of change. And then there's nominal GDP versus inflation. And there's a 2x2 choice to be made. And I think the issues are kind of orthogonal. I'm making the case for nominal GDP, whether you're doing in terms of levels or in terms of rates of change. I understand the arguments in favor of the level, which is it has this elegant way of working in your favor of self-stabilizing, but the disadvantage is, except what if nobody actually believes it? So I'm sort of orthogonal to that. If I could sort of add a point, a number of people have said, well, there's no big difference really. Call it flexible inflation targeting, call it a Taylor rule, whatever. They're in favor of it, I'm in favor of it, which is that you're clear about what the long-run target of inflation is, which is currently 2%, and we've had this whole discussion about whether to raise it or lower it. And then at a shorter horizon, like 1 to 2 years, most central banks still, even after all the troubles, want to be more transparent, want to signal their intentions, even if it's just through forward guidance or a threshold or whatever, rather than setting a formal target. And so they say flexible inflation targeting says you're allowed to take into account output or unemployment. My answer is fine, I agree with that. Let's put it in the Summary of Economic Projections. Summary of Economic Projections has real GDP, inflation, unemployment, short-term interest rate. It doesn't have nominal GDP. I want to put nominal GDP, at least give it that level of salience as to let people know how the Fed is thinking at the 1 to 2 year horizon.
So I'm going to bring back to something you started to mention, which is let's talk about the role of expectation. So all of you wanted to give us some new rule that will help us give more room, as Larry says we desperately need, the next time we hit the zero lower bound. And there were sort of two ways. I mean, sort of the direct way is to say, let's just raise inflation and make it simple. We're just going to change the target, and then we're going to be less likely to hit the zero lower bound, and we're back to sort of the way we used to operate. And then this other way is to say, well, that's too costly, and we can do something, sort of more subtle, which is to say we're not going to raise the long-run target, but we're going to change inflation expectations kind of over time, depending on conditions. And I guess also the way that this would help with the zero lower bound is not to say that we're going to start off necessarily with a higher nominal interest rate, but that somehow because of changes in expectations, the lower bound wouldn't hurt as much. We'd get out of it as fast. Is that the right way to think about this sort of differences? One is that you would get out of the zero lower bound, and two, somehow you would manage the benefits of having higher inflation target without the costs.
many of the papers which were written to try to derive how worried we should be about the zero lower bound basically were done on the rational expectations. And so it was fairly easy to get out. You basically announced there was going to be more inflation, and lo and behold, you did. What we've learned is it doesn't work. Now, does it work? Not at all, or does it work a little? I don't know. That's why, yes, I would much prefer to have inflation just when we need it, but I'm a bit skeptical that it can be done.
So that's right. So the difference between having high inflation all the time and then sort of having it when you need it, for example, exiting from a zero lower bound period, if people think that you're going to overshoot in that exit, has two benefits. One is that it makes the market more accommodative because interest rates, monetary policy can be easier for longer, so rates are lower. But secondly, higher expected inflation lowers the real interest rate as well. So that's as Olivier raised a totally legitimate question, which I think is one that'll be central to the FOMC's debate, is can this more subtle way of causing inflation expectations to change over time, is that really feasible? And I guess my answer is that while it may not be the case that, again, as I said in my remarks, that the average person will understand these subtleties and feed them and factor them into their decision making, I suspect the bond market will. At least initially, that would be enough, I think, to get some benefit from this approach.
Can I go back, given that Larry is gone, make a point that Larry made earlier and would probably make again, which is, yes, you get two effects. You get the hopefully high inflation expectations, that's good. But even if you don't, you actually get lower nominal interest rates for longer. And what he argued is that the room to do this is actually quite limited, starting from the kind of very low nominal rates that we have. You're not going to make a whole lot of difference when the long rate is already very low and will go down even more just because you're decreasing the short rate. So, yes, there are two channels, and even if the expectation channel doesn't work, there's the other one, but the other one I think is very weak.
Let me just question that just briefly. So suppose you have even, I don't know, so you get a couple points that you can reduce on the short rate, and then his argument was you then have 150 basis points on the long rate. The Fed, the usual rule of thumb for the Fed is that that it takes 75 basis points of Fed funds cuts to get a 25 basis point reduction in the 10-year yield. So we're inverting that. 100 basis points on the 10-year yield is worth 300 basis points on the Fed funds rate. It all adds up, I think, to about the amount of total reduction that you need. If you can get the 10-year rate from 150 basis points down to 50, that's quite a bit of additional stimulus.
No, I have to speak for him. But my sense he was arguing that you were getting most of the effect on the long rate without that. And then that additional commitment would not buy much. And the fact that you cut the short rate will basically have an effect on the long rate. The additional commitment to do it for another 5 years after this doesn't buy you much more. But
all right, thanks. Let me keep on the question of this promise to raise inflation. Is this something that is a change? So people sometimes describe this as like an Odyssean rule, which would say you're going to commit yourself to doing something that you might not want to do, or is this something that you think you're just changing the reaction function and people will be happy to do it? I mean, one of the things that Larry, who's not here now, said is somehow that by raising rates right now, the Fed has kind of shown that what they'd really like to do is not, keep to a commitment that would say we're going to overshoot. Now, maybe that's just because that's their current framework. And so, John, what do you think?
I think that last thing you just said was absolutely critical. Our current framework, as described by the committee's document, which we review every January, is basically an flexible inflation targeting framework that states very explicitly that our goal is to obviously balance the two dual mandate objectives, but specifically bring inflation over time back to its target. So what we're carrying out in my view, is a policy that the goal of which is to get inflation back to 2% over the next, a couple years while managing the dual mandate objectives. So I think this is actually, a critical issue in terms of thinking about the current situation versus maybe more like what's the long-term framework. Let me give you an example, and I'd be happy to hear Ben add his views on this example. But one of the challenges the FOMC faced, in my view, in 2009, 10, and the first half of 11, is that market participants were basically at sea about how the Fed's reaction function works when you're at the zero lower bound. And they went, in my interpretation, they looked at history and said, well, the economy generally recovers in a certain way, and the Fed generally lowers rates for a certain period of time, and then over the next couple of years will raises them back to normal levels. So throughout that period, all the way through August of 2011, market participants really were struggling with understanding how we're behaving in the circumstance. They were expecting us to raise rates basically in 12 to 18, starting in 12 to 18 months, despite lots of language in our statements and in speeches that we were going to keep interest rates low for quite some time. It was only in the August 2011 meeting where explicit date-based forward guidance, one of Rick's least favorite topics, was introduced, that we saw a dramatic shift in expectations of markets. And then just as Ben said, what mattered was that the markets understood what we said. I think the 10-year Treasury fell by 20 basis points roughly on that announcement. And we saw with our future forward guidance statements a significant effect on financial conditions. The big advantage to me of a price level targeting or Ben's version of that or some variation on that is that that would be built into the framework, that expectation that we would have lower for longer, that we would be keeping interest rates low, not only to help the economy recover, but to re-achieve our price level target, wouldn't be something we would need to put into our FOMC statements or struggle with how to best do this. This would be the frame. This would be us executing on an agreed upon framework.
So, no, Ben, you gonna?
No.
No.
I agree.
So, it's going down this road. Thank you. It's going down this road at all changing the balance between rules and discretion. Is this kind of making you a little bit more rule-based by saying that you're going to have this history dependence, or not really? Do you think?
I think the issue here, and the whole purpose of actually having a target, is to deal with time and these issues of rules versus discretion, but still have flexibility. So I think that issue is a completely separate issue. And so a Taylor rule could be done with a price level target. If Taylor rule actually has this in it. It has the output gap and the inflation gap. So you could, instead of having, which implies you have an inflation target, you could just do that with a price level target and have a Taylor rule done that way. So that issue is a completely separate one. And I've gone on record that I do not think we should have adopting some kind of rule, instrument rules like a Taylor rule. But I think it's a completely separate issue from the one we're discussing here.
Can I add about this accountability? I think they Oops.
You're on now. You're good. You're good, baby.
Well, what did that other button actually do? I'm curious.
No, it's not your Diet Coke.
Just stop pushing it.
North Korea.
So I think that accountability is something Rick said right at the end of his presentation. It is absolutely critical. I mean, getting the nominal anchor is the most important part of monetary policy, and that's why I am arguing for something like a price level target, because I think that will help anchor inflation expectations even with the zero lower bound. I think from an accountability point of view, it's actually not that complicated. If you have a price level target, obviously with a dual mandate, you can plot the price level target. You can look at where the price level is relative to that target, and of course then go through the normal explanations of why the price level is somewhat higher or lower than the target and what we're going to do to achieve it. I don't actually think that it's any more difficult than a nominal GDP target in that way. You have a level, you're talking about where you are relative to that level, and then how you're best going to achieve your goals over time. And of course, it's important that this is done in a flexible way. Like inflation targeting, you don't try to get back to your target in weeks, months, or even quarters, but think about a strategy that gets you back to your target over a few years and best manages your dual objectives. Okay, I've really done it.
Can I go back to something that you mentioned but dismissed, which is the symmetry of a price level target, which is on one side, when inflation has been too low, it's fairly attractive to say it's going to be higher. But on the other side, when the economy is doing fine, but there is an excess of inflation in the past, you actually have to slow down the machine because you promised. Do you think that there is any credibility to that part of the rule? I mean, my impression that would never happen.
So it's interesting at the American Economic Association meetings that just took place in Philadelphia. Christy and David Romer gave a presentation, and they were looking at nominal GDP targeting. But quite honestly, the same kind of issue could arise there. And they did in their presentation a few historical episodes where they looked at where a nominal GDP, and I would say a price level target would probably have the same result, would have told you to have tighter policy. And the examples were, I think, if I recall right, the late 90s and the mid 2000s, and they made the argument, well, maybe policy could have been tighter in those periods, and it wouldn't, based on their analysis, it wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing. As I showed in my chart that showed the price level target, we did run a few years above the target persistently in the before the recession, and the price level target would call for slightly more tighter policy, but not dramatically more.
So you were talking about how the target audience for the expectations is the markets. So that communications is for the markets and not Main Street. But I wonder if you worry about overshooting, whether or not that would still be the case, whether or not you would start hearing from Main Street that inflation is running really high. I don't believe the Fed anymore. They're just political. They're just responding to the latest. So what is the danger for people who don't understand this more complicated rule, that they would misinterpret it and that would have implications for the Fed and for the.
Let me just. That's why I think this issue about communication is a key element of this, and that if you look at basically what John, Ben, and I, our position is actually very similar. It's really about communication, and I think that's why I like the idea of communicating in terms of average inflation rates, because price level targets, and that's I think is not going to be understandable to the public. But instead of saying that we have an inflation target of 2%, we have an inflation target of an average inflation target of 2% is actually very easy to communicate.
But so it's both, right? It's a change in communication and a change in your reaction function, right? Because, yes. Right, I mean, it's not just communication. Absolutely. It's not just communicating what the Fed's already doing. It's having to change what the Fed is doing and communicating it. So I'm going to turn to the audience in a few minutes, but let me just ask one final question, which is, so we are worried about the possibility of the next recession. We said it could happen kind of any time. And yet we still think that thinking about changing the framework is a very hot topic. What is the timing for this kind of thing? When can it start to how long can we wait? Because now we feel like maybe there's just too much political pressure on the Fed. And how do we go about getting to a place where you could make this change? Because I think it's interesting that everybody here basically wants to make a change. Everybody feels vulnerable for the next recession. And so how do we get to that? How do we develop the political?
Well, I can speak freely since I don't have to. I mean, just based on my experience with the FOMC, I mean, we have presumably a new incoming chairman and new incoming vice chairman. I'm sure that somewhere next year, I would guess in the first half of the year, that the chairman will assign a communications committee to work on this, and with staff support. It would probably be a discussion of up to a year or so. But at some point, I'm just guessing based on my past experience, somewhere in 2019, I think there will be some pretty serious discussions. We had, for those who are interested in, we had similar discussions at the FOMC in, I think it was November 2011, when we were looking at potentially at changing the framework to deal with the exact problems that John was talking about. At that time, I think the general feeling was that the middle of a recession was not the right time to be making those kinds of changes, but I imagine this will come up for a serious debate, in the next year to 18 months. I don't know, again, since it is a big step, I don't know what the public engagement would be after that, whether the FOMC would announce something or whether they would, begin to engage with politicians and the public and so on. I'm not sure about that, but it's certainly something within a reasonable period of time that the FOMC and the staff can evaluate.
Yeah, I really should have said my disclaimer that everything I say reflects my own views and no one else in the Federal Reserve System. I actually think this is part of this important part of the process too. I think that whether conferences or seminars or other kind of forums that we can have where people, in the private sector, academics, experts, along with central bankers, is really an important part of that, to think through these issues. I agree with everybody that you don't want to jump to a new framework without fully thinking through all the risks, all the possibilities, and situations where, and because it's not something you want to do every couple of years. I also want to point out that this has international ramifications. All the issues that we're talking about in terms of a low neutral interest rate, other developments that led to this discussion apply to all the other advanced economies. And in fact, I would argue that in time we'll start applying more and more to emerging market countries as well. So I think that this is an issue not only for us sitting here in Washington or in the U.S., but for central banks around the world to really be thinking through. Because we also know from the work of many economists in the last few years, these very low neutral interest rates, zero lower bound issues have important implications for the international spillovers of shocks and also international effects of monetary policy action. So we really want to think about this very carefully in that context.
Yeah, well, to build on that, the big emerging market countries are dealing with these issues. They do not have a zero lower bound problem. Some of them have a problem of inflation too high. They're sort of back like we were in the 80s and trying to commit to getting inflation down. And they do, as I mentioned, have far more in the way of supply shocks, productivity shocks, weather disasters, natural disasters, terms of trade shocks. And so, I mean, that's partly my case for nominal GDP targeting, particularly applying to them. I want to say something sort of in response to both of the last two questions you asked, Louise. And Olivier said, when we started this, all our models were based on rational expectations. And so whether the goal was to get inflation down, as it used to be in the 80s, or to get inflation up, as it's been lately, our models all assumed that if the central banker were pure of heart, or failing that, if they had their hands tied, like Odysseus to the mast, that it would work, that magically expectations throughout the economy would be transformed, and you could do things like getting inflation up or down without paying output costs. I don't think this discussion is quite, or the discussion among monetary economists has quite adequately acknowledged the extent to which that's failed. That they were pure of heart. They really meant it about the 2% target, and they didn't achieve it, not anywhere. And I think we need to take that into account more. And that just any of these very clever proposals about level or rate of change or whatever, including nominal GDP, probably wouldn't be so transformative on expectations as we think. And that brings me to a concern that Ben had, which is if you open up the process, it'll get politicized. So I actually am, I think, going to vote in a practical sense in favor of what we've already got. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Just a little bit to this issue. That I agree with you. There's an issue about whether rational expectations is as valid as we thought, and particularly the example of Japan, how difficult it's been not only to get inflation up, but to get inflation expectations up, is very relevant. But one of the issues is that when you choose one of these policies, which has this history dependence, which actually, if you undershoot, then you try to overshoot, the actual policy changes, the reaction function changes. And that actually means that you're going to get policy which is likely to lead to higher inflation when you want it. And that in itself produces some good results. So even if people are backward looking, which I think to a great extent they are, it's still one of the great successes of central banks has been that we've anchored inflation expectations at 2%. And one of the results of that is that you see that inflation actually did not get into deflation during the Great Recession. In fact, this man is one of my heroes, for many reasons, by the way. Been good pals a long time. But that Ben is going to go down in history as somebody who actually made sure that inflation expectations stayed anchored. That was the whole, that's what we were trying to do through that whole crisis, which is make sure that we didn't go the route of Japan, where inflation expectations got unanchored in the downward direction. So in that sense, I think that policies which tend to lead you to anchor that, and in fact, in this history dependence, will have benefits in that direction, do exactly what we want in that regard.
I'm going to open up to the audience. I'll take a few questions. Sorry. Right over there. Tell us who you are, please. And I'll take a few and then see who wants to answer them.
Thank you. Krishna Guha with Evercore Partners. Two quick questions, particularly for John Williams and Ben Bernanke, please. The first is, would a price level target be helpful in managing expectations, inflation expectations in normal times? under a condition of a very flat Phillips curve, where you may have long periods away from your inflation target. And the second is, when you have these rules that commit to staying low for longer on the exit from a zero bound, how would you integrate that with financial stability concerns?
Are we going to take a bunch first? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to do it first.
Hi, Kareem Basta with III, also for John Williams. In your presentation, you had a chart on the price level targeting rule and had 2005 as a start date. And so obviously the start date is critical in terms of what policy rate is being prescribed now. And so my question is, number one, how hard would it be to find a consensus on what's the appropriate start date? And number two, who gets to decide? Would it be the FOMC, committee like Ben Bernanke was talking about? Just how you would see that whole process going about?
Okay, one more.
Grade School, Justina Capital Management. Question for everyone. So if returning to 2% is so desired, why don't we go back to CPI like many other countries rather than sticking with core PCE? We changed it about 20 years ago, 18 years ago, and we can always go back at CPI level. I think we are pretty much 2% over a long period of time. Thank you.
So I'll do a quick answer. So, CPI runs and PCE run, CPI runs about a quarter percentage point higher than PCE. So I definitely would not say let's switch to a 2% CPI target at this time. And we've chosen, I think, the broadest measure of consumption prices. The PCE is the broadest index that we have. We think it has, it's a very good measure of inflation. So I think that makes sense. Let me answer very quickly the question about my chart, just because it's actually, there's a technical part and there's a substantive part. The technical part was when I drew that picture for a presentation early last year, I basically viewed 2005 as a place where the U.S. economy was roughly at a full employment. Inflation was running about 2% at that point, and so it seemed like a neutral place to start. And I was assuming a 5% natural rate of unemployment. So basically, that's why I chose that. But obviously, if you're actually thinking about any of these kind of procedures, nominal GDP target or a price level target, that would be one of the considerations. When you start it, what's the right level to start it at and move forward? And I think that gets back to your earlier question of what's the right timing of this debate. The right timing of this debate, I think, is really now, because the U.S. economy has fully recovered from the recession. The economy's in now we're getting close to being the second longest expansion in history, and I'm very hopeful that we'll be getting near our inflation target. So I think that's a good neutral starting point to think about some of these long-term strategies. I think one of the things that's really difficult is, and this is something Ben's already said, but if you're in the middle of a deep recession or a very difficult situation, thinking about changing the strategy does conflate two things: your short-run policy objectives, I want to stimulate the economy or something, and really what's the right framework in the long run. I think we mostly solved the first one. I'm more optimistic about inflation than Jeff. And so I think that now we can really focus on longer-term issues.
Yeah, switching to CPI target would move in the wrong direction because we want a higher target, not a lower target. Good question about, there's some real practical issues with the price level targeting. One would be the financial stability issue. Of course, the standard answer is, well, we use macroprudential and regulatory policy for that. Does it make it any worse than say, having forward guidance? I'm not sure that it does, but it's clearly an issue that we'd have to think about. The other question I think is related to that is, what about if inflation expectations are completely adaptive, let's say, and you have these overshoot periods, does that create destabilizing patterns in inflation expectations? I think the only way to study that in the absence of actual experience would be through some simulations and other model analysis that takes into account those possibilities and tries to look at the range of outcomes. I think the ideal thing, if we could just persuade New Zealand, which introduced inflation targeting in 1990, if we could just persuade it to do price level targeting for 3 or 4 years so we could all find out how it works, that would be a tremendous benefit to the rest of the world.
So Ben, I've tried that when I've been in New Zealand, and they said we did our part by inventing inflation targeting. It's someone else's turn, so maybe Canada will be the...
Here.
More questions? Let's go on this side of the room now. On this side of the aisle. Stand up, please. Good.
Jing Yang from Bank of Canada. I found today's discussion extremely informative. Believe it or not, at the bank, we start to think about the next inflation targeting renewal, which is in 2021. Today, my question is on ELB. I think today most of the discussion is related to the existence of ELB and the frequency of hitting ELB, which limits our central bank's ability to respond. But wouldn't that mean we should tackle the existence of ELB heads-on instead of thinking about alternative monetary policy framework? For example, shouldn't we be thinking about the ways to eliminate ELB, including central bank issuing e-money? Thank you.
Question for everyone. So one of the things we haven't discussed in this is the kind of.
It goes off.
Guneet Dhingra, Morgan Stanley.
Thank you.
One of the things we haven't discussed today is some of the forces on inflation are probably outside the purview of central banks. For example, the role of technology at this point is something not exactly what central bankers would explicitly control. You know, for example, the Phillips curve is a lot flatter than it used to be. Things like that. So I think the question is, you know, is there a consideration that inflation target can actually be lowered instead of being higher, as some of the sort of structural forces on inflation continue to weigh down? And that's been something that's been suggested by the BIS, Claudio Borio, I believe, that inflation targets can actually be lower going forward than the 2%, than moving it higher to 4% or 3%.
Thank you. Joe Gagnon, the Peterson Institute. It came up earlier, the issue of whether we would want to open up congressional legislation and how that might lead to things we don't like. But if it does happen, I guess I'd like to hear what panelists think about possible changes to the powers the Fed could have. And the previous questioner just now mentioned possibly doing things that would remove the lower bound on interest rates so you could have negative interest rates, perhaps. A couple other thoughts which I'd be interested in hearing is one would be the Fed has a lot less ability to buy assets than other central banks. Maybe the normal basket of assets for the central bank should be the market basket of all assets in an economy. Would that be good? And another possibility would be perhaps under very limited circumstances do helicopter money. Maybe when you're at the zero bound and if the Treasury Secretary agrees, you could mail out checks.
Okay, great. Let's answer that.
So on the, it was just on the ELB, and there are two ways to think about it. Is allowing nominal rates to be negative. The other is to increase the equilibrium safe rate, right? The equilibrium neutral rates, and that goes back to why is it that the safe rates are so low? And here I disagree slightly with Larry. And there are basically two ways of thinking about it. One is that it's deep forces like demographics and such, and it's going to be really difficult to do anything. And the other is the safe assets hypothesis, which is for various reasons. There is a very large demand for safe assets, and if we just satisfied that demand, we would actually get a higher equilibrium rate. I'm more optimistic that something can be done on the supply of safe assets to increase the equilibrium rate, and that would go a long way to decrease the probability of hitting the zero lower bound.
I don't want to deal with this question, but I think this is. There's always this issue about when you've undershot a target, should you lower it? And this has come up. I actually did an evaluation of Swedish monetary policy. They had a period just like this, and that was one of the recommendations. I think that's actually the worst thing you can possibly do. And the reason is you get exactly the wrong kind of expectations dynamics. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I didn't like comfort zones. And Ben teased me today about this. I gave a speech called Comfort Zones, Schmumfort Zones when I was a governor to bring a little bit of Yiddish into the discussion of monetary policy. But what happens is if you actually have a fall in inflation and say, gee, just because I can't get there, I'm going to lower the inflation target, that actually has exactly the opposite of the inflation expectation dynamics of the price level targeting. It means that any negative shock is actually again going to propagate even more. And And in the academic literature, this has been discussed. It's one of the big problems that occurs in terms of, for example, during the Great Depression, where you had very negative demand shocks, and then you actually had a deflation set in. That then really means you get a disaster. So I know this issue has been raised, but when you think about the theory of it, you realize that it's absolutely the worst thing you could possibly do in that situation.
Fundamental problem, zero lower bound, and some sort of radical solutions have been suggested, like helicopter money or abolishing cash altogether. Then I just got to return to a question someone asked in the first session when Larry was talking about, what about fiscal policy? I mean, under the conditions of the zero lower bound are the conditions where monetary policy is not powerless, but it's really, really tough. It's precisely the conditions where fiscal policy is most effective. Now, Larry said it's very hard, and he did it, had to deal with it, and he learned that there were no shovel-ready projects, that the fastest projects took a year or 2 years or 3 years. But didn't we learn that would have been great, a year or 2 years or 3 years of fiscal expansion? I think that that's not so hard. More generally, it seems to me, in my length of my career, which is similar to some of the other people's careers here, we have forgotten the most important thing we learned in introductory macroeconomics, which is that you at least want to try to have fiscal policy be counter-cyclical. It's tough to get the timing right. There's political constraints. But the last thing you want is it to be pro-cyclical. What we have in this country and in some other countries is pro-cyclical fiscal policy, or at least some politicians thinking that when the times are good and the economy is booming, that's the time for tax cuts, and only in a recession do you realize that a deficit is a problem, and that's the time for fiscal austerity. I think we economists need to talk more about the desirability systematically of having less pro-cyclical fiscal policy, ideally counter-cyclical fiscal policy, even if we can't get it exactly right. And the payoff to that seems to me it's got to be greater than some of these second-order things we're talking about.
Just add one quick comment to this, which is, I agree with you on this. There's an issue about having, which we've really talked about, is monetary policy capacity. That's the argument for why you would want a higher inflation target. The same issue comes up for fiscal capacity. That if you, in fact, are doing counter-cyclical policy, so when times are good, you're actually doing a little saving, that gives you the capacity to do a lot when times get tough. And actually, so some very nice, the Romers just wrote a very nice recent paper on this, that they looked at countries that had more fiscal capacity and more monetary policy capacity, and they did a hell of a lot better during the Great Recession. So I think that this lesson is actually very important and obviously very current given the recent tax bill.
Hi, Rob Martin, UBS. I was just wondering, all of the policies that you talked about today rely to some extent or another in the central banks having a great influence over inflation. Given that most central banks have missed their inflation target for some period now, do we have to see a period where central banks consistently hit their targets before adopting a new measure? I fear a change in policy still missing and then having even a greater loss of credibility.
I'm going to stop with that question because I think we don't have that much time, and it's a great question. So, and we sort of brought up a little bit, which is, do we actually have a way of achieving any of these new rules?
So, can I respond to this? First of all, I think it goes back to an earlier question. I think, in 2011, 12, it might have been a very difficult time to talk about, any of the issues that we're talking about because it seemed like you were struggling just to do the basics. Now I think we've shown that we've gotten the full recovery. We're on a good expansion. Expect inflation to be moving to target. So I think it is a better time, for at least in the United States, and to have this discussion. I will push back on this premise that we lack credibility in the United States because we've been missing our inflation target. Janet Yellen gave a really great speech last year about the inflation experience during the economic recession, during the recovery, and highlighted that up until 2016, roughly, the shortfall inflation was exactly what our Fed models, such as they are, what it would predict. We had a period where the unemployment rate was very high due to the severity and length of the recession. We had some other factors such as the import prices, commodity prices, and things like that, which obviously affect inflation. So, in fact, the inflation story, the fact that we missed on our inflation target was a direct consequence of this very deep and long recession and slow recovery. To me, you know, it's not a sign of a failure to achieve our inflation target, but much more just a reflection of the difficulty of getting the economy back on track. Now, a lot of people focused in 2017 about the fact that inflation dipped after rising almost to 2% or to 2% early in the year. But of course, that's a reality with inflation. It tends to move up or down for various factors. I mean, the critical part for me is not that inflation was below our target in terms of the credibility of the Fed during the recession. It's really that we achieve our inflation objective going forward. So now I think, though, that this gets back to one of the advantages of price level targeting, that when you have an extended period of missing your targets, you are committed and going to carry out inflation that's somewhat above. And I don't think that is, you know, I don't think that's that difficult a mission to actually accomplish.
All right, well, with that, I'd like to, I hope you've all enjoyed the session as much as I have and learned as much as I have. And I'd like to thank you,